Hello, my name is Dale and these are my books. Today we're going to be talking about a book which came up in the book club that I'm a member of, and we read a book called The Queering of the American Child by Logan and James Lindsay. Now, this is a really interesting book for me to review because I'm going to encourage you not to read it, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, it starts off with a really big claim. It's talking about gender ideology from an anti-woke point of view, and that means that the idea that boys can become girls and girls can become boys, that there's more than two genders, and so on. And the book starts out by making a really big claim. It says that queer theory is a religious cult systematically poisoning the minds of American children. So it's really blunt about where it's coming from right from the beginning. And it goes through a number of things that you would expect such a book to talk about. It talks about queer theory itself, it talks about its intellectual history, it talks about it as a form of queer Marxism, and it says that this ideology has infiltrated government and education and medicine and society more broadly. It describes queer theory not so much as a political position, but as a religious movement whose aim is to attack the idea of normality. It wants to abolish the family, it says, and ultimately capitalism, and that it has gone into the tentacle-like into all sorts of institutions, including schools and medical associations and government bodies, as I mentioned before. It uses lots of phrases which are used by the queer ideologists themselves, such as queer pronouns and homonormativity. Homonormativity was a new one for me. I didn't know that word. And it talks about Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. And it concludes by saying that this is nothing less than a battle for the minds of the next generation. Now, the reason why I was looking forward to reading this book is because it has an afterword by somebody called David Lindsay. And if people are interested in woke politics and anti-woke politics in particular, then you will know the name David Lindsay. He runs a website called New Discourses, and there is a phenomenal amount of his work on New Discourses, and he's written serious academic papers, as well as some satirical academic papers, which he and his colleagues have had published in woke magazines, and that's the whole story in itself. The problem with the book, however, it has two problems. One is that not David Lindsay, but the author of most of the book, and that is somebody called Logan Lansing, cannot write. Simply cannot write. It is turgid to read. It is difficult to read. You really have to struggle. And the approach is one of, let's look at the woke people. Oh, what a crazy example. Aren't they mad? Oh, here's another example of a crazy thing. Here's another example of a crazy thing, without really getting into a sustained argument, except for saying a whole lot of things which are then not really backed up in a very systematic way. And for this reason, I would just say, don't read it. There are better things for you to read. So, having said that, what I would say is that if you want to read something about wokeism, postmodernism and the new left in general, then from a critical perspective, meaning from a small c critical perspective, then the one chapter that I would really recommend you read is a chapter on the history of woke ideology called Into the Cannibal's Pot, Lessons for America from Post-Apartheid South Africa by Ilana Mercer. Now, this was written in 2011, and there's a chapter in there which is just beautiful. It really describes, it's well written, and it talks about what wokeism is, and I would really recommend that. if you want to get a book which is perhaps a little bit easier to read, then I would recommend Cynical Theories by David Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. Um, what this book does is that it does a systematic review of the intellectual history of wokeism, but it also then looks at various branches of wokeism. So it will look at feminist studies, queer studies, fat studies, race, and so on. And again, I have to say that Lindsay just isn't a very good writer too. In fact, as I was going through the book, I found that I could read the first paragraph of every chapter of that book, that is Cynical Theories, and I could tell almost straight away whether that was a chapter written by Lindsay or whether it was written by his co-author Helen Pluckrose. Helen Pluckrose, by the way, is a very good writer. Not only is she very interesting to read and very analytical and very thematic, but she has the gift of the gab. She can just write. One is tempted to say, or to note, that Helen Pluckrose's background is in history. She's used to reading and writing books, and perhaps that's really helped. David Lindsay, on the other hand, his background is in mathematics, and some people can do numbers and some people can do letters. Very few people can do both, and I'm afraid David Lindsay just can't do both. So that's the way it is. If you would like to read a book about transgenderism from a critical perspective, then I would suggest Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. It was published in 2020 and it's by Abigail Schreier. And that is a book which I thought was very interesting to read and certainly very good than the book that's being reviewed at the moment. However, if you also want to look at trans ideology from a pro-trans perspective, if you believe that men can become women and there are more than two genders and so on, then you may be tempted to read someone like Judith Butler. Judith Butler is the high priestess of gender theory, particularly when it comes to trans stuff, and she is famous for being really unreadable. It's really almost like going over a religious text. There's layers and layers of meaning, or it's a little bit like poetry. You know, there could be a metaphor, then you have to look at the metaphor from a dozen different angles, and it's really like reading a religious text or a piece of poetry that's obscure but without any aesthetic appreciation. It is mind-numbing, and I have to say at least thank you to David Lindsay for reading all of this turgid stuff and trying to make sense of it. I can see how it would really affect your brain after a while. However, if you do want to read a book from a pro-trans activist, then I have a book to recommend, and it's this one. It's called Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. Julia Serrano is herself a trans woman, and the great thing about this book is that although I disagree with about 95% of what she says, Julia Serrano knows how to write, and there'll be a page, for example, where she'll be talking about the trans community in a particular place at a particular time, and you read it and you think, wow, that's really interesting, and then she continues. So this is a slightly odd review of the book. I'm saying don't read the book. Life is too short. But there are other books like Cannibal's Pot and Cynical Theories and Irreversible Damage and Whipping Girl that you can read a lot more enjoyably and also learn a lot more along the way. And I hope this has helped. Thank you for listening.